Before you start to glaze, it's critical that you degrease the surface of your painting. Whether it's a panel or a canvas, it doesn't matter. You have to degrease. To do this, I just use a mixture of ammonia and water. I save time by just using a commercially available window cleaner. I use a rag that has been well washed and dried so that it contains no lint. I spray the rag with the cleaner and I very gently wipe down the surface of the panel. I inspect the entire surface of the panel carefully to make sure I haven't missed any spots, and then I let it dry thoroughly. So it's purple and yellow, and they neutralize each other because they're complementary colors. So if you mix it correctly, it should neutralize into a very dark neutral color. And what it should do is just darken whatever you painted over. So I like to start out with the raw umber. And what I'm looking to do is to add enough ultramarine violet so that it stops looking brown. So it's no longer identifiably brown. So when I'm done, hopefully it won't look purple and it won't look brown. That's how you know you got it right. Is it should no longer look either brown or purple. It should be unidentifiable as a color. And at the point where it's no longer purple or brown, it's unidentifiable. That means it's neutral. And it's a lot harder to do than you might think. Because I'm working on a white paper, it's a little bit easier to gauge than if I was working on a wooden palette. I think that's good. I'm going to try this. That's about the consistency that I like my glazes to be. I'm working with liquid fine detail. I'm not using any solvent, so there's no terp in this at all. Making sure there are no streaks of paint in it, that it's really well mixed to a consistency that I like, and I don't see any streakiness or any clumps of paint. So that's what I'm going to work with. You can't over mix it, but you could certainly under mix it. So be careful. Don't try to rush through this process of mixing your glaze. I'm going to glaze this reflection. This is a black granite tabletop, and these objects are being reflected down into this black granite tabletop. And I have worked on the painting up to this point, painting these reflections as if it was a mirror. And I'm hoping that when I glaze the tabletop, that the reflections will read as being part of the table instead of these objects sitting on a mirror. And I realized that I can't just use a black glaze. And I do occasionally use black glazes. That doesn't sound like it would make sense, but sometimes a black glaze is just what you need. But I realized that because this box is a very yellowish color, that if I put a black glaze on top of this box, that black glaze would turn this color very green, because black is basically dark blue. And that would just look awful. So what I have to do instead is put a very dark neutral color. And this glaze that I'm going to use should work, but we're going to have to see. If it doesn't, I'll wipe it off and I'll try something else. So let's see. I have degreased the surface of the panel so that this doesn't bead up on me. Sometimes glazes can bead up like water on a newly waxed car. It'll pull away from the surface and form little beads on the surface of your painting, and you don't want that. It will ruin the painting. I think this will work. Glazing is kind of tricky business. People don't realize that. And most of it you learn from experience. If you don't understand color theory, you're not going to be able to glaze. That thing about putting a black glaze over this part of the painting, if you did that, you'd see it go green real quick. And if you didn't know how to handle that, your whole painting could be in big trouble. You wind up with this bright green box and not know what to do about it. Also, you'd see this streakiness here, and it might tend to freak you out a little bit. Now, when I get back here, I'm going to add some black into that glaze, just because of the fact that when I get back here, I'm not going over this yellowy sort of area. Also, when I get into these tighter areas, as I get up to the base of these objects, I'm going to have to switch to a smaller, finer brush. If I'm putting on kind of a heavy glaze right now, and that's because I'll be wiping it back. It won't be quite this heavy. I can't think of a situation where you would just put on a layer of glaze and you'd be done. Normally, you're putting on a layer of glaze and then you're smoothing it out, or you're texturing it. You're doing something else in addition to just applying the glaze. Otherwise, you can wind up with a streaky effect, and you almost never want that. Using a very soft, dry brush. See, I'm kind of pouncing. Also, I'm being very careful, trying to be very careful not to leave any hairs in the glaze. That's one of the biggest problems with glazing, is this. Do you see now, as I'm pouncing this too, one of the other effects of this pouncing is that it's getting rid of the brush strokes. It's also picking back up a little bit of the glaze, because you're still going to work with that glaze. This is why you're working in oils instead of something like acrylics. You're going to put it down and then you're going to adjust it. When I'm up here working on it, I can't gauge the complete success of this because my face is just right up on this panel. I really, and you'll see this too, when you're working like this, you have to wait until you back up and look at it to see whether or not you got it right. I'm not going to add black right this minute. I'm going to probably come back and do that in another glaze, maybe. I thought I would. think that's working. Very soft brush here. When you're working on a glaze, so this might even be a watercolor brush, I don't know. But this is the sort of brush that you baby, this sort of brush. You wash it out with soap and water every single time you use it, because you don't want any hard places in this brush. Don't do this and just leave your studio. Don't do it and think it's a done deal, because assuming that everything was okay, you can, if you leave for the weekend, you could come back in and that thing might have wept down the surface, and with beads of glaze that when you come back in after the weekend, they could have dried into hard droplets on your surface, and you've ruined your painting. And quite possibly truly ruined your painting. So don't do that. Pay close attention. Inspect that painting. Stay with it. This is the sort of thing, it's good to do it when you first get into the studio, you know, in the morning, and every hour or 45 minutes go over and closely inspect the surface and make sure that nothing scary is going on, because if it is, you can wipe it off, leave the painting alone for a few days and come back and do it again, and figure out what went wrong. You know, was it too wet? Did you forget to degrease the surface? Is there something you did wrong? Did you use the wrong colors? All kinds of possible things that you might do differently next time. So if you get it wrong, wipe it off, walk away, let it dry, come back and try it again. But if it looks okay, babysit it for several hours. You know, keep going back and checking on it. Don't do this if you just swept your room, because on a panel, the act of brushing creates sort of an electrostatic charge on the surface of your panel. It will attract dust. So if you've cleaned the room and dust is churned up in the air, if you live close to a highway and stuff is churned up in the air, you just don't want to do it under those conditions, because stuff will get glued to your canvas. Now, notice that there's no highlight down here reflected on this surface. If I had painted the highlight in the underpainting, then putting that glaze on top of it, the glaze would have accumulated in the highlight and it would look terrible. So I'm probably just going to put the highlight, I'll put a darker version of this opaque color on top of that glaze when this thing is dry. But I will let this thing dry very thoroughly. I'll decide whether or not, I may not even want to put another glaze on this. This may be darkened enough, I don't know. I have that's part of living with it, you know, is making that decision. If I felt like I had gone too dark, which I don't think I did, I would take a brush and wipe back in little areas, but let this thing dry and make your decisions a little at a time. But make yourself just go slowly and make your decisions slowly. I like that. I think it looks good.